In the pantheon of World War II tanks, certain names immediately come to mind: the Soviet T34, the American Sherman, the German Tiger. These tanks captured imaginations and became legendary. But there was another German tank that, while less famous than the Tiger or Panther, was arguably more important to Germany's war effort. The Panzer IV was the workhorse of the Wehrmacht, the only German tank to remain in continuous production throughout the entire war and the most numerous German tank produced. While Tigers and Panthers grabbed headlines, Panzer IVs formed the backbone of German armored divisions from the invasion of Poland in 1939 to the final defense of Berlin in 1945. The Panzer IV's story is one of continuous evolution. It began as a medium support tank, armed with a short-barreled 75mm gun designed to fire high-explosive shells against infantry and fortifications. It evolved into a tank destroyer capable of engaging enemy armor on equal terms. The upgrades were constant: better armor, better guns, better transmissions, better suspension. Each improvement was a response to battlefield experience, to enemy developments, to changing tactical requirements. The Panzer IV that fought in Poland bore little resemblance to the Panzer IV that defended Berlin 6 years later, yet the basic chassis remained recognizable throughout. This adaptability was the Panzer IV's greatest strength. While other German tanks were designed for specific roles and struggled to adapt to changing circumstances, the Panzer IV's design proved flexible enough to accept modifications that kept it competitive throughout the war. It wasn't the best tank in any single category. It was never the most heavily armored, never had the most powerful gun, never was the fastest. But it was reliable, available in numbers, and good enough to remain effective from the war's first day to its last. The origins of the Panzer IV lie in the German Army's rearmament program of the mid-1930s. After the Nazis came to power in 1933, Germany began openly violating the Versailles Treaty's restrictions on military development. The German Army needed modern tanks, and specifications were issued for several different tank types to fill different roles. The Panzer I and II were light tanks for reconnaissance and training. The Panzer III was designed as a main battle tank armed with an anti-tank gun. The Panzer IV was conceived as a support tank that would accompany Panzer III's, using its larger gun to destroy enemy fortifications and suppress infantry positions. The design contract went to Krupp, one of Germany's premier armaments manufacturers. The lead designer was Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp, an engineer who had extensive experience with cracked vehicles. Kniepkamp's challenge was to create a tank that was larger and more powerful than the Panzer III, yet still mobile enough for offensive operations and simple enough for mass production. The result was a design that appeared conventional but incorporated numerous thoughtful engineering decisions. The Panzer IV had a crew of 5: commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, who also operated the hull machine gun. The turret housed the commander, gunner, and loader, providing good crew coordination. The driver and radio operator sat in the hull. This crew layout became standard for German tanks and proved effective throughout the war. The original armament was a short-barreled 75mm KWK-37 L-24 gun. The L-24 designation meant the barrel was 24 calibers long, 24 times the diameter of the bore. This relatively short barrel gave low muzzle velocity, making the gun ineffective against tank armor but excellent for firing high explosive shells against infantry and fortifications. The Panzer IV also carried 2 7.92mm MG-34 machine guns, one coaxial with the main gun and one in the hull. Armor protection on early Panzer IVs was modest, only 30mm of frontal armor, barely adequate against anti-tank guns of the late 1930s. But the design philosophy prioritized mobility and firepower over protection. The tank was powered by a Maybach HL108TR gasoline engine producing 250 horsepower, later upgraded to the HL120TRM producing 300 horsepower. Maximum speed was about 40 kilometers per hour on roads, with cross-country speeds significantly lower. The first Panzer IV, designated Ausführung A, Model A, was completed in 1937. Production began slowly, with only 35 Ausführung A models built. Successive models, Ausführung B, C, and D, incorporated incremental improvements. By the time Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, approximately 200 Panzer IVs were in service. This was a small number compared to the thousands of Panzer I and II light tanks that made up the bulk of German armored forces, but it represented the beginning of what would become a massive production program. The Polish campaign provided the first combat test of the Panzer IV. The tank performed its intended role effectively, supporting Panzer III tanks and providing fire support for infantry. The 75mm gun proved excellent for destroying Polish fortifications and suppressing Polish anti-tank positions. Mechanical reliability was generally good, though some problems emerged that would be addressed in later models. The campaign validated the basic design while revealing areas for improvement. The invasion of France in May 1940 saw expanded Panzer IV deployment. By this time, the Ausführung D and E models were entering service, featuring improved armor and better reliability. Approximately 280 Panzer IVs participated in the French campaign, again serving in their design support role. They proved effective against French fortifications and infantry positions. When they encountered French heavy tanks like the Char B1 bis or British Matilda IIs, the Panzer IV's short 75mm gun struggled to penetrate their armor. But the overall success of the campaign meant these limitations were not considered critical problems. The experience in France, however, highlighted a troubling reality. German tanks were not superior to all Allied tanks. French heavy tanks and British infantry tanks had armor that German anti-tank guns and tank guns struggled to penetrate. German victory in France came from superior tactics, operational planning, and coordination between armor, infantry, and air power, not from tank versus tank superiority. This lesson would prove critical when Germany faced even more formidable opponents. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, shattered German confidence in their tank designs. Soviet T34 medium tanks and KV-1 heavy tanks were shockingly superior to German tanks. The T-34 had sloped armor that provided excellent protection, a powerful 76.2mm gun, wide tracks for mobility in mud and snow, and a diesel engine that was more reliable and less flammable than gasoline engines. The KV-1 had armor so thick that German tank guns and anti-tank guns often couldn't penetrate it at combat ranges. German tank crews reported instances of their shells bouncing off Soviet tanks without effect. The 37mm guns of Panzer III tanks were almost useless against T-34s and KV-1s. The Panzer IV's short 75mm gun, firing high explosive shells designed for bunker busting, was only marginally effective. German armor superiority, which had been assumed in planning Barbarossa, proved illusory. The Wehrmacht was fighting with inadequate equipment against an opponent with better tanks in greater numbers. Oberst Ludwig Bayer, commanding a panzer regiment on the Eastern Front, described an early encounter with Soviet armor. "We engaged what we thought was a medium tank formation. Our Panzer IIIs fired first. We saw shells hit and bounce off. The Soviet tanks, we later learned they were T-34s, returned fire and destroyed two of our tanks with their first shots. We closed range and continued firing. Some shots penetrated, but many bounced off even at close range. The Soviet tanks seemed almost invincible. We eventually destroyed them through flanking maneuvers and concentrated fire, but it cost us dearly. That evening, we counted the hits on one destroyed T-34, over 20 hits, most of which hadn't penetrated. We realized we were facing a tank far superior to ours. This crisis forced rapid German response. The immediate solution was tactical: use superior training and tactics to overcome equipment disadvantages, concentrate fire on individual targets, attack from the flanks where armor was weaker, and use 88mm anti-air.
The gun itself was upgraded during the war. The original L-43 version was replaced by the L-48 version with an even longer barrel, providing better armor penetration. By 1944, Panzer IVs mounting the L-48 gun could engage most Allied tanks effectively, though they struggled against heavy tanks like the Soviet IS-2 or the American M26 Pershing. Armor protection improved continuously. Additional armor plates were bolted or welded onto existing armor, particularly on the front of the hull and turret. Later production models had thicker base armor. Shorts-en, thin armor skirts, were added to the sides of the hull and turret to protect against Soviet anti-tank rifles and hollow-charge weapons. These modifications increased weight, affecting mobility and reliability, but were necessary to keep the Panzer IV competitive. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 saw Panzer IVs deployed in large numbers. The German offensive, aimed at destroying Soviet forces in a salient around the city of Kursk, involved nearly 3,000 tanks and assault guns, including approximately 900 Panzer IVs. The battle became the largest tank engagement in history, with thousands of armored vehicles fighting across hundreds of square kilometers. Panzer IVs formed the numerical backbone of German armored formations at Kursk. While Tigers and Panthers attracted attention and propaganda emphasis, Panzer IVs did much of the actual fighting. They proved capable against T-34s when well handled, though Soviet numerical superiority and defensive preparations made German success impossible. The offensive ultimately failed, marking the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Hauptmann Hans von Luck, commanding a panzer battalion at Kursk, described the battle. "We advanced in waves, Panzer IVs forming the majority of our force with a few Tigers in support. Soviet defenses were formidable: minefields, anti-tank ditches, layered defensive positions. Our Panzer IVs performed well in tank versus tank combat. The long 75mm gun was effective against T-34s, but the sheer numbers we faced were overwhelming. For every Soviet tank we destroyed, two more appeared. We advanced, but at terrible cost. By the time the offensive was called off, my battalion had lost 2/3 of its tanks." The Panzer IV remained in production throughout 1944 and into 1945, even as more advanced tanks like the Panther became available. This continued production reflected several realities. First, the Panzer IV was simpler and cheaper to produce than the Panther or Tiger, allowing higher production rates. Second, the Panzer IV remained effective in its role, particularly in defensive fighting, where its gun could engage enemy tanks from prepared positions. Third, Germany's industrial situation made it easier to continue producing existing designs than to retool for new ones. Production numbers tell the story of the Panzer IV's importance. From 1937 to 1945, approximately 8,500 Panzer IVs were built, making it the most numerous German tank. By comparison, about 6,000 Panthers were produced, about 1,350 Tigers, and only 492 King Tigers. The Panzer IV represented the foundation of German armored strength, with more advanced tanks supplementing rather than replacing it. The Western Front after D-Day in June 1944 saw extensive Panzer IV combat. German armored divisions defending Normandy included significant numbers of Panzer IVs. In the bocage terrain of Normandy, small fields surrounded by thick hedgerows, the Panzer IV's combination of firepower and relative mobility proved useful. The long 75mm gun could destroy Shermans at typical combat ranges, giving German crews a fighting chance despite Allied numerical and air superiority. However, the Panzer IV's limitations became increasingly apparent in Western Front combat. Allied air superiority made daylight movement extremely dangerous. Allied artillery was overwhelming in quantity and effectiveness. Allied tank destroyers like the M10 and M36 Pershing had guns that could penetrate Panzer IV armor easily. The Panzer IV remained dangerous when properly employed, but could no longer dominate battlefields as German tanks had in 1940 and 1941. Lieutenant Robert Boscawen of the 2nd Armored Irish Guards described engaging Panzer IVs in Normandy. The Panzer IV was a serious opponent. Its gun could kill a Sherman from the front at ranges we couldn't effectively return fire. We learned to be cautious, to use terrain and concealment, to avoid frontal engagements when possible. When we did fight them directly, we needed numerical superiority or tactical advantage. They weren't invincible, their armor wasn't proof to our guns at close range, but they demanded respect. The Germans positioned them well, used cover effectively, and made us pay for every yard we advanced. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 saw Panzer IVs participating in Germany's last major offensive in the West. The attack, launched through the Ardennes, initially achieved surprise and made significant gains. Panzer IVs formed a substantial portion of the German armor involved, with Tigers and Panthers in supporting roles. The offensive ultimately failed due to fuel shortages, clearing weather that allowed Allied air power to intervene, and stubborn American resistance. But Panzer IVs proved they remained capable of effective combat even in the war's final months. The final battles in defensive Germany saw Panzer IVs fighting desperately against overwhelming odds. Soviet forces advancing from the east had massive armor superiority in both quantity and quality. American and British forces advancing from the west similarly outnumbered German defenders. Panzer IVs fought in small groups or individually, ambushing Allied tanks from concealed positions, inflicting casualties, then retreating before Allied firepower could respond. These final battles were characterized by German tactical skill partially overcoming material disadvantages. Experienced Panzer IV crews, fighting defensively in familiar terrain, could still achieve tactical successes. But strategic defeat was inevitable. Germany lacked the fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement crew to sustain combat operations. Panzer IVs were abandoned when they ran out of fuel or broke down, as no recovery or repair capability remained. Some were destroyed by their crews to prevent capture. Others were simply left where they stopped, silent monuments to a lost cause. Lieutenant Karl Fuchs, commanding a Panzer IV in the defense of Berlin in April 1945, described the final days. "We had no fuel, no ammunition, no hope. My tank was positioned covering a street approach to the city center. We had perhaps 20 shells remaining. Soviet tanks came, T34s and IS-2s. We engaged, destroyed 2 tanks, then ran out of ammunition. We abandoned the tank and fought as infantry with small arms. The war was lost, everyone knew it, but we fought anyway. I don't know why. Duty, fear of what would happen if we surrendered, perhaps just momentum. We had fought for years and didn't know how to stop." The technical evolution of the Panzer IV throughout the war demonstrates the importance of adaptability in weapons design. The Ausfuck A of 1937 and the Ausfuck J of 1945 were vastly different machines in terms of armament, armor, and capability, yet they shared the same basic chassis and layout. This evolutionary approach allowed continuous improvement without requiring entirely new designs, maintaining production while upgrading combat effectiveness. The Panzer IV's mechanical reliability was generally good, particularly by German standards. While Tigers and Panthers suffered from mechanical problems due to rushed development and over-engineering, the Panzer IV benefited from years of gradual refinement. The engine, transmission, suspension, and other systems had been tested and improved through multiple production variants. By 1944, the Panzer IV was one of Germany's most reliable tanks, a crucial advantage when spare parts and maintenance facilities were increasingly scarce. The crew positions in the Panzer IV reflected thoughtful design. The commander, positioned in the turret with good all-around visibility, could effectively command the tank and coordinate with other vehicles. The gunner had clear sightlines and good controls. The loader had sufficient space to work efficiently, important for maintaining rate of fire. The driver had adequate visibility and good controls. The radio operator could perform his communications duties while also operating the hull machine gun. This ergonomic design contributed to crew effectiveness and reduced fatigue during long operations. Training for Panzer IV crews was extensive in the early war years, but declined in quality as the war progressed and Germany's situation deteriorated. Early war crews received thorough training covering all aspects of tank operation, gunnery, tactics, and maintenance. They practiced coordinated maneuvers, live-fire exercises, and simulated combat. This training produced highly effective crews who could maximize the tank's capabilities.
By 1944 and 1945, training was much abbreviated. Fuel shortages limited driving practice. Ammunition shortages limited gunnery training. The need for replacement crews at the front meant training was rushed. New crews arrived at frontline units with minimal preparation, learning through experience, if they survived long enough to gain it. The decline in crew quality contributed to the declining effectiveness of German armored forces in the late war period. The tactical employment of Panzer IVs evolved throughout the war. In the early years, they operated in combined arms groups with infantry, artillery, and air support, using mobility and firepower to break through enemy positions. German tank tactics emphasized aggressive maneuvering, concentration of force at decisive points, and rapid exploitation of breakthroughs. Panzer IVs were part of this offensive doctrine, providing fire support and dealing with enemy strongpoints. As the war turned against Germany and defensive fighting became predominant, Panzer IV tactics changed. Tanks were positioned in prepared defensive positions, using terrain and concealment to ambush attacking Allied forces. The Panzer IV's gun was effective in this role, allowing it to engage enemy tanks from good positions at favorable ranges. Defensive tactics emphasized destroying the first wave of attackers to disrupt Allied momentum, then withdrawing to secondary positions before being overwhelmed. The Panzer IV served in virtually every theater where German forces fought. In North Africa, Panzer IVs fought in the desert campaigns from 1941 to 1943. The desert environment presented unique challenges. Heat, dust, and sand affected engines and equipment. Mechanical reliability problems increased, and maintenance became more difficult. But Panzer IVs proved adaptable, and German forces in Africa relied heavily on them. In Italy, Panzer IVs fought in the mountainous terrain of the Italian peninsula from 1943 to 1945. The terrain limited mobility and emphasized defensive fighting, roles the Panzer IV could perform effectively. In the Balkans, Panzer IVs fought partisan forces and supported occupation duties. In Scandinavia, small numbers of Panzer IVs were deployed in defensive positions. The tank's versatility allowed it to operate effectively in diverse environments. Panzer IVs were also exported to German allies. Romania, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Finland all received Panzer IVs. Finland used them effectively against Soviet forces, praising the tank's reliability and firepower. After the war, some Panzer IVs continued serving in various armies. Syria used Panzer IVs in the 1960s and 1967 conflicts with Israel, though by then the design was hopelessly obsolete. The longevity of Panzer IV service, continuing 2 decades after production ended, testified to the basic soundness of the design. The cost-effectiveness of the Panzer IV was a significant factor in its continued production. A Panzer IV cost approximately 103,000 Reichsmarks to produce, compared to 250,000 Reichsmarks for a Panther and 300,000 Reichsmarks for a Tiger. For the cost of 1 Tiger, Germany could produce 3 Panzer IVs. Given Germany's resource limitations in the war's later years, producing multiple adequate tanks was often more practical than producing fewer superior tanks. Production facilities for the Panzer IV were well established and efficient. Multiple manufacturers produced components, with final assembly at several plants. This distributed production made the program less vulnerable to bombing than concentrated production would have been. Even as Allied bombing intensified in 1944 and 1945, Panzer IV production continued, though at reduced rates and with increasing quality control problems. The human stories of Panzer IV crews reveal the tank's central role in German armored operations. Crews formed strong bonds, living and fighting together in the confined space of the tank. They depended on each other completely: the commander's decisions, the gunner's accuracy, the loader's speed, the driver's skill, and the radio operator's communication all contributed to survival and success. Unteroffizier Paul Egger, who served as a Panzer IV gunner from 1942 to 1945, described crew relations. "You lived with these men in a steel box measuring perhaps 6 meters by 3 meters. You ate together, slept together when you could, fought together, and sometimes died together. The crew became your family. You knew each man's strengths and weaknesses, his fears and hopes. In combat, you functioned as a single organism. The commander would spot a target and give the order. I would aim and fire. The loader would have the next round ready, the driver would position us optimally, the radio operator would coordinate with other tanks. It was a ballet of violence, and when it worked, we were extraordinarily effective." The psychological impact of tank combat on crews was significant. Tank combat was intensely claustrophobic, fighting from inside a steel box, unable to see clearly what was happening outside, hearing impacts on the armor, wondering if the next hit would penetrate. When armor was penetrated, the results were often catastrophic. Anti-tank rounds entering the tank could kill crew members directly, ignite ammunition, or cause the fuel to explode. Crew members who survived their tank being hit often suffered severe burns or other injuries. Obergefreiter Heinz Schneider, who survived his Panzer IV being destroyed by Soviet anti-tank fire, described the experience. "We were advancing when I saw a flash from a tree line. There was an impact on our frontal armor, a tremendous bang, and the tank shook. The driver screamed that we were hit, but the armor held. We returned fire. Then there was another impact, this time on the side. The shell penetrated. I don't remember much. There was fire, smoke, noise. I found myself outside the tank without knowing how I got there. The driver and radio operator were both dead. The commander lost an arm. The loader and I were burned, but alive. We were the lucky ones. We survived." Many crews didn't. Post-war assessment of the Panzer IV by historians and military analysts has been generally positive. The tank is recognized as perhaps the most important German tank of World War II, not because it was the best technically, but because it was available in numbers throughout the war and remained effective through continuous upgrading. Military analysts point to the Panzer IV as an example of successful evolutionary design, starting with a sound basic concept and improving it incrementally based on combat experience. The influence of the Panzer IV on post-war tank design was limited. The basic configuration, crew layout, gun in rotating turret, diesel or gasoline engine, was already standard and would remain so. Specific features of the Panzer IV weren't particularly revolutionary. The tank's real lesson was strategic rather than technical. Having adequate numbers of good enough tanks is more valuable than having small numbers of excellent tanks. Post-war military doctrine in many nations emphasized producing reliable, reasonably capable tanks in large numbers, rather than pursuing technological perfection in limited quantities. From a historical perspective, the Panzer IV embodies the rise and fall of German military power in World War II. In 1940, Panzer IV spearheaded the attack on France, participating in one of history's most stunning military victories. By 1945, Panzer IVs were fighting desperately in the ruins of Berlin, trying hopelessly to stave off inevitable defeat. The tank saw Germany at its most powerful and most desperate, fighting in victory and defeat, offensive and defensive, conquest and collapse. The men who designed the Panzer IV, Heinrich Kniepkamp and the engineers at Krupp, created a tank that exceeded expectations. They designed a support tank that evolved into an effective main battle tank. They created a chassis adaptable enough to accept continuous upgrades, keeping it competitive for nearly 8 years of intensive warfare. They produced a design simple enough for mass production, yet effective enough to remain dangerous to the end. The crews who fought in Panzer IVs experienced the full spectrum of armored warfare. They knew the exhilaration of victory in Poland and France, the shock of encountering superior Soviet tanks in 1941, the renewed confidence when the long 75mm gun arrived in 1942, the grinding attrition of Kursk in 1943, the defensive desperation of 1944, and the final collapse of 1945. They fought with courage and skill, achieving tactical successes that couldn't overcome strategic defeat. From the first Ausuf A rolling off the production line in 1937 to the last Ausuf J surrendered or destroyed in May 1945, from the plains of Poland to the deserts of North Africa, to the steppes of Russia, to the streets of Berlin, the Panzer IV served as the backbone of German armored forces. It wasn't the most famous German tank. That distinction belongs to the Tiger. It wasn't the most advanced. The Panther was technically superior. But it was the most important, the most numerous, and the most consistently effective German tank of World War II. The workhorse of the Wehrmacht earned its place in history not through individual brilliance, but through reliable, continuous service under the most demanding